First of all, a very warm welcome to you at the Faculty of Political Science, and thank you for taking the time to talk about your research with us. We have as a guest for this episode part-time Professor James Dennison from the Center for Migration Policy from EUI in Florence, and also he's a researcher at the University of East Anglia. As far as I understand, most of your research dwells into migration and anti-migration attitudes, some party politics related to how that's framed on the party level and how that interacts with values on the individual level. And I guess I usually start these interviews by asking maybe a bit of a personal question. I think it's a softball, maybe it's not. But I'm interested in can you pinpoint the time when you figured out that science is something that you want to do as your life goal?
Oof, wow.
So it's not a softball.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that's a softball. I'd say that's a big question. I would say, I mean, it's hard to answer a question like that and not get a little bit pretentious, but I was always interested in the social sciences. So growing up as a child, that was always my sort of main interest. Social studies, as it was called, or humanities, or under different names, and I studied political science as an undergraduate, but not really in scientific terms. It was much more theories of politics, that kind of thing. There was no sort of hypothesis testing or anything like that. I would say I don't think I could pinpoint a specific time. I did a master's in much more political science. That was the first time I did my thesis, when I was actually testing hypotheses. And then I actually left academia for 3 years after that. And I must say it was very frustrating having had that training in some quantitative methods, fairly basic but still, and thinking in that scientific way to be out in the world and not doing that. So maybe it was around that time that sort of the frustration I had led me to come back and do a PhD at the EUI. And then from then on, really, I was surrounded by people thinking about politics and the social world, moreover, in scientific terms. And I really, from then on, I really, that potential in me just completely came out, and that's what I wanted to do. I never second guessed it.
So it would be fair to say that you caught the scientific mind virus at the MA.
Exactly,
yeah,
I would say so, yeah. I would
okay.
say so.
So one of your most cited articles or most influential piece of work that you did dwells into something that you term the rising tide of the anti-immigration politics or parties, and where you actually try to explain that it's a dubious term whether it is a rising tide or not. But what I found specifically interesting about that article is the way it starts and how you explain the relevance of dealing with such issues by referring to a couple of meetings that you guys had with the representative of the European Commission. Can you tell us something a bit more about that? Because it's not so common that we see in full-fledged real scientific articles some reference to what's actually going on on the ground.
Yeah, so I mean, I always think it's important to think about your research questions, whatever they are, in terms of scientific interest. So why this is not obvious to us, why this isn't intuitively obvious, and we need to test it scientifically. But I also think it's important to think about science in terms of substantive importance. So why does this matter in the real world? So the example you were giving there, this was years ago now, this must be 7 years ago, but I had just started working on a large project on attitudes to immigration. And as part of that, particularly at the start, we were going to European institutions, international organizations, and so on. And the meetings that we were having, there was this big presumption that attitudes to immigration across Europe were getting worse. And that's a totally understandable assumption, because there was the rise of radical right parties at the time. The Brexit vote was around that time, also the first election of Trump was around that time. However, the data just didn't bear that out. Actually, attitudes to immigration in terms of your positivity to the effects of immigration, whether you think there should be more or fewer migrants, and so on, showed pretty clear stability, even moves towards positivity at the aggregate in almost all Western European countries, and also in Central and Eastern Europe as well, actually. Stability being the major sort of driving force. So, in that case, I mean, the article actually showed that it wasn't people's preferences about immigration that causes the rise of, or fall as well, of radical right parties, but the importance that they place on the issue relative to other issues. So these latent anti or pro-immigration sentiments stay fairly stable, but then they're activated by events, by particular trends, by all sorts of things. Actually, we don't know that well what activates it, but we do know, my paper showed, that when there's this uptick in the salience of immigration, then we soon see an uptick in the vote share of radical right parties. Anyway, that's a long way of answering your question, which is, in that case, it was quite useful to frame this strange puzzle of attitudinal stability but electoral instability in terms of what the policymakers actually think.
But by some sort of event. I think it's a very similar argument that we see in a very adjacent literature on populist attitudes and activation. And I also, when I was reading that, I was thinking about this specific thing that you wrote in a couple of places in that article by saying that the pool of those voters is increasingly shrinking. So my follow-up question to that specific argument would be, what do you think how your findings are holding up today when we take into account maybe the last several electoral cycles, perhaps in Sweden, where Sweden Democrats had one of the best historical results, or Geert Wilders in Netherlands, or the most recent one from the time when we are speaking about these topics, the FPO had the best historical result ever. So wouldn't that suggest that there is an increasing pool of voters that's available to those parties, or there's something in that mechanism that's quite different and maybe still applies to your argumentation from several years ago?
So when it comes to those specific parties, bear in mind that these are parties operating in multi-party systems. So they may come first in an election, but on relatively small vote shares, 20-30%. And that's the first thing to think about in terms of the parties. In terms of the voters and the shrinking pool of voters, well, it depends how deep we go. If we think in terms of one's deepest values and so on, I wouldn't say that there's shrinking pool of voters. I would say that we should expect a normal distribution and that to be stable over time across all sorts of value metrics, and we can think about different social psychological theories for that. But where there certainly was a shrinking pool, and relative to 10, 15, 20 years ago there still is a shrinking pool, is in terms of specifically unambiguously anti-immigration sentiments. So that means we don't want immigrants and we don't want them under any circumstances. And it's sometimes easy to forget that that was pretty much the prevalent view in most Western countries until certainly during the 20th century. So what we've seen in the last 10, 20 years is, well, I would say in the last 20 years, a rise of more favourable attitudes to immigration, which by necessity means that there is a shrinking pool of anti-immigration voters. But as immigration's become a lot more salient, a lot more visible as an issue, a lot more nuanced. So people's attitudes have become a lot more nuanced, and that can be measured because we see multidimensionality in the structure of immigration attitudes. Rather than all yes to immigration or all no, the latter being more prevalent, we see much more yes under the circumstances, no but, in terms of specific groups of migrants, specific types of labour migrants, or specific rights or specific duties to protect refugees, or all kinds of issues. Because one effect of immigration being in the news so much is that people know a lot more about immigration now. So they're able to, their attitudes are far more crystallized on the very deepest psychological predispositional level, I don't think much has changed, because I wouldn't say immigration itself constitute, or attitudes to immigration constitute a deeper value. Those are timeless things. However, your attitudes to immigration to some extent are manifestations of your deeper values or psychological needs. So the attitudinal pool of voters available to anti-immigration parties over the last 30, 40 years has shrunk on the one hand. On the other hand, that is always a complex interplay between the attitudes of voters and the political supply, so the demand and the political supply in terms of what the parties are offering. And then finally, the article, of course, argues quite simply, aside from everything I've just said, that those parties will benefit or not benefit according to not the attitudes anyway so much as the salience of immigration, which itself is not so simple. So the percentage of people saying immigration was an important issue can go up, it can go down. It went down a lot during COVID. It went up, it has gone up during various so-called crises of migration. But that's complicated as well, because people, when we talk about salience, we don't mean in absolute terms, we mean in relative terms. So that means this measure is highly reliant on the salience of other issues. And that's actually very good social science that we've constructed it like that, because psychologists have shown that people can only think of, people only prioritize 2, 3, maybe 4 issues at a time in their personal lives and in their political lives, to the extent that their attitudes affect their behavior, prioritizing to that level. So these parties will go up and down much more, certainly in the short term, according to the salience of immigration than the changing attitudes, not least because they don't change that much.
So what would you say is the main mechanism of raising the salience of some issue? Because you just mentioned that it's very important to think about this in relative terms to specific individuals. Is it on the one hand let's say maybe some general characteristics of the system in terms of how much media and political parties pay attention to specific issues, or is it more related to individual experiences of individuals with specific issue and how it relates to their everyday life? Maybe, I don't know, maybe being in a vicinity of migrant centers, or being in a vicinity of a train station, of a main train station in a city that can boost your feeling that, okay, this is actually a problem that has to be dealt with in a specific manner.
So that's a fantastic question, and I think that question we haven't made enough progress on as social scientists, not just with immigration, but with all issues. Why sometimes do we consider X issue important and other times Y issue important? Where the social scientists have generally focused is on so-called agenda setting, which is the first of the two explanations you laid out, which is this idea that the media and politicians strategically and sometimes malevolently are able, through what they say and what they do, to affect the salience of issues. Now, I'm skeptical of that. I'll just be totally honest and open with my priors. I don't doubt that they do have the ability to do that. Of course they do. But there's good reasons to think that their ability to do that is quite limited. One is they're in competition with each other. So in the media ecosystem, all these media bodies have to respond to what they think consumers are likely to want to read about, and to thus buy their papers, or these days click on the link. So they're quite constrained. They're not able to just talk about what they want. And in the political situation, even more. If one party can raise the issue of immigration, for example, like the radical right, then why don't other parties raise the issues of other issues? And probably they do, and there's some sort of equilibrium reached by that happening. So I think that media and political figures act as facilitators. I think what's happening in the real world by which I simply mean outside of the agency of media and political figures, is ultimately going to affect the salience of something. And I've had caveats to that comment, of course, major ones, but let's take the example of COVID. So immigration was generally a pretty salient issue from 2015 to 2016. It went down a little bit after that, but it was still a highly salient issue across Europe. However, when COVID came along and the economic costs of that, which were going to be quite obvious almost immediately, immigration salience plummeted. That wasn't significantly by, from maybe 50% down to 10% in some cases, or so roughly. No one can realistically argue that an agenda setter made that happen. There was genuinely a real world pandemic. Now, agenda setters could accentuate or frame or do all sorts of things, and they do that, and that does have effects, I have no doubt. But that is just undeniable. Another example would be, the financial crash or all sorts of things. So I think the real world, which is a strange sort of term to use, but things beyond media's control have effects. That said, that doesn't mean that people are fantastic at choosing what's going on in the real world, because there are all kinds of things going on in the real world. Endless. So it's true that people will still choose things according to their own biases, according to their own values, according to their own what's most emotionally exciting. But also, I don't think we should write off the ability of citizens to be relatively competent at understanding their societies. So all these things make a difference. I don't think we've made as much progress as we should have as social scientists in deciding what does the most.
Just to put it back to the second mechanism as well, because I'm mostly interested in individuals and the decision-making process on the individual level. So I've been hearing more and more about the scope conditions of something that in your work you called economic backlash, or economic insecurity, sorry, and not only you, but it's generally the phrase that it's being used in the literature. And I hear more and more people saying that it can be a very useful explanation for a very specific part of the electorate, namely former immigrants that now have a citizenship status, and that they are the ones who are most prone to feel economic insecurity with the new wave of migrants, because it's their jobs that are kind of threatened with the new migration waves. Do you find that plausible at all?
I'm not familiar with that work, maybe I've seen that, but I think it's plausible. I think these things like economic backlashes and insecurity, it's really important, and if you've ever lived feeling economic insecurity, you know that it is all-consuming. It's when it's particularly acute, it's what you wake up thinking about first in the morning, you go to bed thinking about at night, and even if it's less acute than that, it still plays a major part in your life. That said, I think my initial calls for some skepticism, as social scientists, we're all about skepticism, so on that would be twofold. One would be people tend to use economics for a few reasons as a proxy for a lot of things. So one reason would be that it's easier to say that anti-immigration is caused by economics than is caused by actual anti-immigration sentiment, because then you don't have to deal with anti-immigration sentiment, you just have to deal with economics, so that the prescription becomes quite obvious. You improve inequality, you improve economic performance. So I think we should be skeptical that it's not being used in a motivated way, that it's not being selected as a mechanism for motivated reasons. The second reason, I think, is that we should be skeptical in thinking that, as I mentioned earlier, this underlying normal distribution that I think is very deep in people, or across people I should say, on all sorts of things, abilities, views, temperaments, all kinds of things. We see it again and again, not just with humans, but across science. Why would that not also exist in immigrant groups? in terms of political attitudes and deeper values. So I suggest it does, and very soon after integrating, that reversion to a normal distribution in terms of, let's say, ideology will naturally, as much as in the native population, come to the fore, because that maybe that identity will wear off fairly soon, which traditionally we would say keeps immigrant groups tied to left-wing parties. But we shouldn't be surprised when there's a reversion to that. So yes, there may be economic backlash, but to me, the main reason people choose political parties is the ones that align with their political outlook in the long term, and in the short term, ones that deal with the issues that they think are most important affecting the country.
So related to the issue question, so you mentioned before that we know now that people generally tend to focus on 3-4 issues that are important in their lives, and one of the interesting things that I read about in your own research is that you dwell into issue ownership, and specifically how UKIP was able to take issue ownership from a very fringe party to bring it to the frame of big British politics, right? And when I was thinking, when I was reading that article, I remembered just seeing a couple of polls in the last month in Hungary, where so according to those polls, Fidesz now has something around 39%, and Jobbik is around 1%. And I remember 10 years ago, Jobbik was the forerunner or the front runner of anti-immigration politics and Hungarian nativism. But throughout this process, Fidesz has somehow managed to take issue ownership of those things and completely, let's say, politically obliterate Jobbik from that picture. Can you tell us a bit more about, maybe from the perspective of UKIP, how that process of taking issue ownership goes at the party level and it's manifested in the political system?
Sure. First, just commenting, I wasn't aware of that Hungarian trend that you mentioned, but that is extremely stark, and I think that's very useful to understand issue salience, issue ownership, what we call issue competition, which is these things can be quite fast moving. So that makes them have high potential for political change, because you can perhaps steal issues, you can lose issues. I think the UKIP case is indicative of what's happened a lot in particularly Western European context, which is a mainstream party has an issue. So on immigration, the Conservatives for 50 years, maybe a bit less, were what we would say they owned the issue of immigration, which is the public generally associated them. When we call issue ownership is essentially a bundle of things. The extent to which a party is associated with an issue, the extent to which a party is deemed competent on an issue, the extent to which a party is deemed to care about an issue, all those things which together represent the link between what issue we deem important and which party we will therefore vote for. So in the UK, let's take a converse example. Health has always been associated with the Labour Party. So if people are worried about health, who do they vote for? They'll vote for the Labour Party because, as I say, Labour are deemed to care more, they're deemed to be more competent, and they're deemed to just be generally associated with the issue. So what happened with UKIP on immigration was a similar pattern, as I say, we see elsewhere. The Conservatives were in government, immigration stayed high, they had promised to lower immigration, and so they lost the issue of immigration. They no longer owned it. They weren't deemed competent. The link between the issue and the party broke down like a chemical reaction, you could say. They were no longer connected. So then we exist in this middle phase where no one is associated with an issue, and that's really when we see the word that at least British journalists love, this febrile time when all the parties are trying to get the issue because they can see that this is up for grabs, this is powerful, and if I can get this issue, the next time it's salient, whether I make it or someone else makes it, I benefit. Who was able to do that? Well, it wasn't the Conservatives because they were in government, they weren't able to get it back. it wasn't the Liberal Democrats because they were also in government, and it wasn't the Labour Party because they had just been in government when immigration had gotten very high. So that created a vacuum, and in that, it wasn't that new, but a relatively new party, until then a minor party, UKIP filled that vacuum and was getting, very quickly was able to see their vote share increase because they started in more and more voters' minds very, very quickly. All these links formed, which is immigration as an issue, UKIP as a party. If I care about immigration, I vote for UKIP. So from then on until basically UKIP ceased to exist, which was caused by many things, but essentially Brexit and the Conservatives becoming similar to UKIP, rebranding themselves as the new UKIP. UKIP kept that issue. The Conservatives briefly got it back, although they lost it again. What did we see happen? A new radical right party came in called Reform UK, which is essentially a continuation of the old UKIP.
You made a nice segue to maybe the last topic that I want to open up. You said that there's a vacuum, and then there's a new party in the UK, the Reform UK. And I wanted to ask you about, specifically, you wrote an article about Spain and Portugal, and how radical right parties there managed to, first of all, taking into account the history of those countries and the fact that they had fascist dictatorship for decades, that it was a bit surprising that now we have an established radical right parties such as Vox in Spain. One of the mechanisms that you explain in your article is that they avoid stigma of being a party that's not available for, let's say, decent vote from the electorate. Can you explain a bit more how that process goes? How do parties brand themselves as an available choice for the voters?
Sure. So this is something that, I mean, other people have done more research on them than myself and my co-author on this paper, but we applied it to the Spanish and Portuguese cases. So what we argued and was well known was that for a long time radical right parties in Iberia suffered from a stigma, which is the stigma of extremism, and therefore it was considered something certain you wouldn't talk about openly voting for such a party. Now, how did Vox, the Spanish radical right party, get around that stigma issue? Well, we argued that they did a few things. One is that they associated themselves with an issue that has nothing to do with race or immigration. And we see that across Western Europe. So in Vox's case, it was the question of Catalan independence, most obviously. In the UK, it was Euroscepticism. With the AfD in Germany, it was the issue of the single currency. And we see all sorts of examples of that. But this is called, by one political scientist, a reputational shield. So this allows the party to enter the party system and say, we're not racist, we're not extreme, we're not any of those things which are unsavory. We just care about bad macroeconomics in the case of the single currency, or upholding the constitution in the case of Spain. So that allows people to break the habit of not voting for them, to start voting for them. That allows them to get media exposure, that allows them to get all sorts of things, which we actually showed was the case of Vox in Spain. The media talked about them in favourable terms in a way that they never did with the radical right predecessors, who were just dismissed immediately. So this reputational shield really matters. The other way you can get a reputational shield, besides the issues you focus on, is your origins. So a lot of those older radical right parties just started as Francoist in the case of Spain, or neo-Nazi elsewhere parties, basically. And so, yes, they tried to rebrand themselves, but the route was very clear. In a lot of the newer radical right parties, their roots are actually in the centre-right party, or even occasionally they have members from the centre-left as well. So that means that they can say they have this history of legitimacy behind them in terms of their leadership. And that means they appear more normal, they maybe already have media connections, they essentially are, except it's a lot more difficult to dismiss them out of hand.
So they basically start out as not extremist parties, but at some point they pick up on issues that might deem them extremist. That would be the process in a maybe very, very, very simplistic way.
Well, I mean, if we're going to be strict in our terms about extremists, at least in terms of radical right parties, extremist parties consider those who are anti-democratic.
Yeah.
So I don't know if Vox would be an extremist party genuinely, but they would certainly be radical right. That's clear, and I think that fits in better with my idea. What you see in the UK, what you see in Spain. We have multi-party systems in both countries, and those parties' vote shares, more or less, with some variation, fit on a normal distribution. So that can be flatter at times, that can be skewed at times, but you see most people in the middle, centre-right, centre-left, but then reasonably large far left and far right parties. And in Spain, you just unambiguously see that. In the UK, it's a bit more ambiguous in terms of the left, although you do have the Green Party now, which I argue operates basically as a far left party. So, to go back to stigma, to go back to salience, to go back to all those things like stigma stop that normal distribution emerging. A little bit like we were talking about with immigrant identity. So these deeper things that stop you, stigma, identities and so on, stop this normal distribution emerging essentially. And when those things are broken, we see a reversion to a normal distribution in terms of political attitudes and therefore the distribution of the parties to meet those attitudes.
Okay, maybe the last question, because I don't think we mentioned it at all. Do you think there's a space or a role of EU politics in legitimizing these parties? Maybe membership in the party families, running for EP elections, and having MPs in the European Parliament, and generally maybe creating some kind of a network on the European level?
That's not a question I've thought about, and perhaps other academics have, and I'm sure they have. I know that a few have worked on radical right parties in the European Parliament specifically. If I think of the case of the UK, clearly that is what happened, because there are a few things happened. So in the UK you have a majoritarian electoral system in Westminster elections, so in the national elections, and that has historically been very bad for minor parties. It just creates a two-party system artificially. The European elections since 1994 in the UK have been proportional though. So that meant, to fit in with your hypothesis, if I can call it that, perfectly, gradually people voted for these parties more, which meant that people got a habit of voting for these parties. And it meant that these parties then, UKIP, in the case of the UK and others, and equally the Greens, you could argue, got habitual voters, but they also got exposure. They got reputations because maybe they were able to achieve things in these parties, stop certain things happening or whatever it might be. They got platforms, and they professionalized. So that would be an extreme case, I would say, in the UK, if that happening where you had a two-party system before. Elsewhere, I wouldn't be so sure. I mean, the other thing that it does make me think about is this Europeanization of the radical right, particularly after Brexit. So before that, these radical right parties tended to be very Eurosceptic. And these days, I think it's safe to say, when you think about Fratelli in Italy or Vox, in fact, they cooperate much more. So they think much less in terms of anti-Europe and anti-European Union, and much more in terms of a much differently formed, I suppose, intergovernmental Europe. So that may also be an effect of the European elections as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if they manage to demonstrate that they are willing to, let's colloquially say, play ball at the European level, that can have a spillover effect in how people perceive them, or voters perceive them in their own countries. Thank you very much for this conversation. Is there anything else that you think related to the issues and topics that we raised throughout the conversation that we need to go back to and maybe provide additional comments to?
In terms of additional comments, I don't know. I would reiterate that I think social scientists should focus more on the causes of salience, because I consider that one of the biggest drivers of change. And yeah, I think for now, that's about it. The other thing I would just say, of course, is thank you very much for having me, and to anyone watching, what a good job I think the faculty at the University of Montenegro are doing in terms of internationalizing, professionalizing, creating better political science. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you for being our guest, and thank you for the kind comments at the end. See you in the next episode.